Well, that's a pretty interesting way of putting it, Bev. Hi, and thanks for having me. The Taliban basically set the conditions for their attendance at this Doha meeting. It's the third Doha meeting around Afghanistan. The first one they weren't invited to. The second one in February this year, they were invited to but refused to go because there was going to be the presence of civil society and women's groups. And I think what's been happening is that the United Nations didn't want a meeting about Afghanistan without the Taliban to happen again, so they crumbled. They basically said yes to everything that the Taliban wanted, and that really was essentially no civil society and no women. So all that was represented there was not Afghanistan, not Afghanistan's people, it was the Taliban. The Taliban take this as tacit recognition, even though you heard Mrs. DiCarlo say it's not about recognition, it's about engagement. That's not how the Taliban take it. For them, this is all good news, and they came out of that meeting yesterday and said everything's good because everything went our way.
Yeah. You know, the Taliban has expressly said that that we should not, the outside world should respect their religious and cultural values. Do you think it in any way legitimizes the Taliban's views and discrimination really against women by not engaging with civilian groups, by talking to the Taliban at all?
I think it does, Bev. There's a lot of countries, a dozen or so countries already have ambassadors in Afghanistan. China has accepted a Taliban ambassador in Beijing without saying, without the protocols of acceptance. He's there. The Indian government is also at a loss of what to do, and so they basically handed over the embassy in Delhi to Taliban figures there. This is a growing awareness, I think, that the Taliban are here to stay, even though most Afghan people don't want them. You have a growing opposition around the National Resistance Front that says what they want is elections. Now, the Taliban aren't going to have elections because they wouldn't win elections. So it is a tacit recognition. They get enormous amounts of money, between 40 and 80 million US dollars a week in cash. More than $2 billion so far has poured into Afghanistan since they took over. It's all working for the Taliban. They're making some demands that there were no concessions given on in the last couple of days, including the release of Reserve Bank funds up to $9.5 billion that was held outside the country during the Republic era. Nobody can really trust them with what to do with that, but those talks are going on as well. So I think that it's easy for the Taliban to say, look, we're here and we're here to stay. The international community is doing what we want them to do.
Yeah. And, you know, on those grounds, is there any progress from these talks on economic issues, making life better for Afghanis, the whole counter-narcotics efforts, knowing what is going on in Afghanistan?
Well, the United Nations organisers also said that counter-narcotics efforts were going to be on the table at this two-day Doha meeting as well. All very well, but they didn't talk about methamphetamine. You and I have talked about that in the past, that the Taliban have all but eradicated poppy production as an agricultural crop. Which looks good on paper, but what they've been doing is moving into meth. Methamphetamine is much cheaper to produce, and the money that it earns them is much higher for the quantity. So none of that has been discussed in the last couple of days. So I think it's a little bit of a whitewash, if I may say, that the United Nations can now walk away and say, look, we had talks with the Taliban. More than 30 countries were represented. It all went well. We're still putting pressure on them where we can to make life easier for women. And then everything comes down to how they treat women, not anything else. But the UN is able to walk away and say, well, we ticked a lot of boxes, and the Taliban can walk away and say, we're in.
Yeah. You know, from your observations with this money coming into the country, what is life like for the average Afghan?
it's not getting any easier as far as I can determine. As you know, it's not easy to do proper on-the-ground reporting now. Reporters that are going in at the moment to do third anniversary stories are very closely watched. They can come in, it's very expensive to be there. They have to tell the Taliban everything that they're doing, except the presence of Taliban officials shadowing them around the country. So there's no real reporting. Anybody that they speak to, any ordinary people, are going to be afraid to say what it's really like. The United Nations is still in the if we don't get more money, there'll be famine mode, but there's no way of really independently assessing what's going on. What we do know is that women are sequestered, so half the population is not contributing to any economic activity. Very few jobs because the Taliban aren't able to develop an economy that can create jobs. Very little anyway. Foreign investment going in there. China is in, as I said, with money for the mining and minerals sector, but that's not really making any money or creating sustainable employment. So I think we can probably say that with confidence that it's terrible. It's a really dire situation, and the only thing that is keeping Afghanistan from failed state status is international money going in there, and the Taliban takes a lot of that as well, as we know.